I'm really happy to have Dirac Twidwell with me today to talk about one of our favorite trees that we use for windbreaks in the state of Nebraska. Dirac, we're having all sorts of issues with the windbreaks in the state of Nebraska and the Plains states. We've lost the pines to things like pine wilt. We have spruce that are going down from drought or age or the combination of things. So cedars are really sort of our go-to evergreen for windbreaks. But what is up with the cedars?
So there's a growing concern about cedar simply because as it spreads into environments where it formerly was absent or where it was rare, we've started to see a lot of changes of things we value from our grasslands and our forests that are more native. And so that's where a lot of the concern's growing and why it's being called an invasive species.
Cedars are a native plant, but if we attach the word potentially invasive or invasive, just exactly how are they spreading and what is the impact of that spread into bike path areas, city areas, waste areas, rangeland, pasture?
I think it's a real point of confusion amongst what makes a species invasive. And for scientists, invasion is a biological process that's not about its political origin. And so that's where that confusion comes from. Cedar, there's lots of areas in Nebraska where it wasn't at before. No different than a species coming from China and like Chinese tallow tree in the southeast. It just had much less distance in order to travel to go to areas where it wasn't before. But it has the same types of biological invasion pathways that make a species invasive. It starts out, and as it goes into new areas, you see this lag and slow growth phase. And so it takes a long time for invasive species to become established before you see this threshold and this rapid increase in their abundance. And so you actually get normalized to it, you get used to it in these areas, and you don't think it's going to be a problem. And then all invasive species go through this logistic growth function, or this big rapid increase. And that's what we're seeing with cedar.
So how exactly are you going about helping people try to figure out why they need to control and how to actually control both the existing ones and the spread of future cedar invasions?
Yeah, so the first question that everyone has is how do we control them? And there's no state that across broad, expansive landscapes has stopped the spread of cedar. And once it gets established, it's so expensive with how we want to try and control it that no state has reversed it across big landscapes. So everybody wants to try and control it. One of the reasons we think that we've failed in multiple areas is simply because you can't just use control methods if the seed source keeps coming. It's kind of like controlling dandelions on your property and your neighbor has dandelions next to it. You're going to have a dandelion problem. Same things with cedar, just on big landscapes the size of a state. Now, people are using a lot of techniques to control it. The biggest challenge is how do we manage across big enough areas? So prescribed fire is a big method, and we know that one works because Plains Indians used it for thousands of years to keep cedar in areas where it couldn't spread. Haying really is something that people don't think of when they're managing cedar, but you're constantly keeping it out because as it's just sprouting, you're cutting it off at the base and so it can't get big. And so those are two of the biggest prevention methods. When you start seeing cedar, that's when we say you have a problem, right, as soon as you can see it. So people use hand shears, axes, cut it off that way. If it gets really big, then you're talking about more big mechanical equipment. In the southern plains, it's $1 million to do 1,000 acres. That's why we can't get it restored to what we want. It's so expensive. So those are the big ones, but we want to try and learn to avoid the real expensive restoration type practices and go towards more prevention.
Homeowners and small commercial businesses in cities have used cultivars and varieties of cedars or junipers for eons, and there's some pretty great ones on the market. Do we need to be concerned about whether they are going to begin producing seed, and short of the straight species seeding itself about in native or natural landscapes, they're actually going to become a problem in managed landscapes? What do we look for there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and that's what we're trying to just get people to think about more. We haven't really paid attention in any state of how much should we be focusing on our seed propagation, these horticultural techniques we're using in our backyards, and we're acting like we can plant them there and they won't spread, and they spread. So should we start looking at how we're planting, how we're selecting for certain traits, where we're actually spreading cedar ourselves, and just starting to ask those questions. I think our biggest message is that people need to start focusing in more on this is something that's a problem and how are we contributing to it already, and the seed source is one of our biggest issues. So that way we're not just throwing it on other people and saying you just need to control it, it's your problem. We're contributing to that on our neighbors' properties. So how can we do a better job of getting ahead of it?
So I'm not really sure that anybody is actually going to like the answer that you gave them, but what I'm hearing is that we should be cautionary. We should take a peek at or take a real good look at what we are purchasing for use in our own home landscapes or on the farms, and keep posted with all the great information that you are going to provide for us. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good point.